Oklahoma, 1945. The cold water hit their skin like 1,000 needles, and the screaming began. Not screams of pain, but something deeper, something primal that echoed off tile walls and froze the American guards in place. 12 German women stood naked under government-issued showerheads, trembling, weeping, clutching each other as water pooled at their feet. The guards had expected resistance. They had not expected this. The sound of dignity shattering, of women who believed they were about to die. What happened in that shower room would haunt both captors and captives for the rest of their lives. The train rolled through the Oklahoma Panhandle in February, its windows frosted with ice despite the afternoon sun. Inside the converted freight car, 14 German women sat on wooden benches bolted to the floor, their breath visible in the cold air. Greta Hoffman pressed her forehead against the glass, watching endless wheat fields blur past, golden stubble breaking through patches of snow. She was 26. She had not seen her daughter in 3 years. The women wore mismatched civilian clothes, donated garments from American charity drives that hung loose or pulled tight in all the wrong places. Some had managed to keep a single photograph. Others had nothing but the clothes they wore and the numbers stitched onto canvas armbands. They did not speak much. The journey from the East Coast Processing Center had taken 5 days, and exhaustion had settled into their bones like sediment. Maria Schultz sat across from Greta, her hands folded in her lap, fingernails bitten to the quick. She had been a nurse in Hamburg before the war, before the bombs turned the hospital into rubble, and her life into a series of desperate choices that ended with capture in France. She stared at her hands and wondered if they would ever feel clean again. The propaganda had been specific. Americans were savages who would torture prisoners, defile women, leave them to starve in concentration camps of their own. The newspapers had shown photographs, some real, most fabricated, of skeletal prisoners and mass graves. The radio voices had been certain, absolute in their warnings. Trust nothing, expect nothing, survive if you can. Yet the train car had heat. The guards who checked on them spoke quietly, almost apologetically. At one stop, a Red Cross volunteer had distributed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thick slices of bread with actual meat inside, cheese, pickles. Greta had eaten hers slowly, mechanically, waiting for the nausea that never came, for the poison that must be hidden inside such abundance. The sandwich tasted like betrayal, like everything she had been told was a lie wrapped in white bread. The train slowed. Through the ice-crystalled window, Greta saw a water tower with Alva painted in black letters, then wooden buildings arranged along a dirt main street, then nothing but prairie stretching to the horizon. The wheels screeched against cold metal rails. The train stopped. Fort Supply prisoner of war camp materialized in the late afternoon light like a mirage. Guard towers rose above chain-link fences topped with coils of barbed wire. Long wooden barracks painted military green stood in precise rows. Beyond the wire, the land rolled away in waves of brown grass and red dirt, empty of everything except sky. The wind carried the smell of dust and livestock, and something else, something neither European nor entirely foreign, a combination of wood smoke and prairie distance that Greta could not name. The women were ordered off the train. They stood on the platform clutching their small bags. 14 figures surrounded by American soldiers in winter coats, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. A captain with a clipboard called names, mispronouncing most of them. He looked young, barely 30, with lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen things that aged him beyond his years. "Welcome to Fort Supply," he said in careful, practiced German. His accent was terrible. "You will be processed, assigned barracks, and given orientation. We follow Geneva Convention protocols here. You have rights. You will be treated fairly." Maria laughed, a short, bitter sound that made the other women flinch. The captain's face hardened slightly, but he said nothing more. He gestured to a waiting truck. The processing building was overheated, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and coal stove smoke. The women were led down a hallway with linoleum floors that squeaked under military boots. Doors lined both sides. each labeled with official designations that meant nothing to prisoners who could barely read English. They stopped at a door marked Sanitation. Captain Morrison, the processing officer, consulted his clipboard with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times with male POWs. He nodded to the female MP standing beside him, Corporal Helen Davies, a stocky woman from Nebraska with a face like granite and eyes that revealed nothing. "Strip down," Corporal Davies said in German that was even worse than the captain's. She made a gesture, pointing to the shower room visible through an open doorway. "Delousing protocol. Regulations." The women stared. Greta felt her chest tighten, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She looked at Maria, whose face had gone white. Around them, the other women stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. "Now," Corporal Davies repeated, louder this time. She pointed again at the shower room. No one moved. The hallway felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward. Greta's mind flashed to stories. Whispers passed between prisoners during the Atlantic crossing, tales of what happened to women in camps, stories that ended with screaming or silence or worse. Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably. He had not expected this resistance, this paralysis. Male prisoners complied quickly, eager to wash away weeks of transport grime. This was different. The fear in the room was tangible, thick enough to taste. "It's just a shower," he said, softer now, trying a different approach. "Clean water, soap, standard procedure." But the words meant nothing. The women had heard promises before, official reassurances that preceded horrors. They had been told they would be safe in bunkers that collapsed. They had been promised food that never came. They had learned that authority lied, that official protocols often concealed unofficial cruelties. Corporal Davies stepped forward, her hand moving to her belt, to the authority she carried there. Her face showed no sympathy, only the hard determination of someone following orders who would brook no opposition. She grabbed Greta's arm. "Strip," she said again, "or we'll do it for you." The hallway erupted. Women began crying. Not gentle tears, but harsh sobs that tore from throats raw with fear and exhaustion. Greta pulled away, stumbling backward, her breath coming in short gasps. Maria sank to her knees, hands over her face. Others clutched each other, speaking rapid German, prayers and curses mixed together. "They're going to kill us," someone whispered. "This is how it happens. The showers." Like they said. Captain Morrison raised both hands, genuinely alarmed now. He had seen men break under interrogation, had witnessed the collapse of soldiers who held too much inside for too long, but this was something else. A collective terror so profound, it transformed the hallway into a chamber of raw human agony. "Nobody is going to hurt you," he said, his voice rising to be heard over the crying. "I swear to God, this is just—" But Corporal Davies had already grabbed another woman, was pulling at her coat. The woman screamed, actually screamed, a sound that made the MP hesitate for just a moment before she renewed her grip, yanking at fabric that tore in her hands. The shower room filled with bodies and noise. Some women were pushed, others stumbled in while being half-carried by guards who had no idea how to handle this situation, who'd been trained for resistance but not for this kind of fear. Clothes were removed, torn away by American hands or shed by German fingers that shook so badly they could barely manage buttons. Then they stood there, 14 women naked under fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, their skin pale and marked with old bruises, scars, the topography of a war written on flesh. They held themselves, arms crossed over breasts, hands covering what they could, bodies turned away from the guards who had backed against the tile walls, uncertain what to do next. Corporal Davies turned the water on. The pipes groaned, coughed, and then cold water erupted from the showerheads in violent streams. The screaming began again, but different now, higher-pitched, more desperate. Some women dropped to the wet floor, curling into balls, hands over their heads. Others pressed against the walls, trying to escape the water that pounded their skin. Greta stood frozen in the center of the room, water streaming down her face and body, her mouth open in a silent cry that would not come. She had expected gas. She had expected death disguised as sanitation. The lie her government had used against others now turned against its own people by an enemy that must surely operate the same way. She had expected the water to burn, to choke, to kill. Instead, it was just cold, brutally, achingly cold, but just water. The realization came slowly, creeping through terror like dawn through fog. The water stayed cold. The air stayed breathable. The guards stood watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror to something that might have been shame. Nobody died. Maria uncurled from her position on the floor, water pooling around her, and looked up at Corporal Davies. The MP held a bar of soap, white and ordinary, wrapped in paper stamped with military insignia. She held it out like an offering, like an apology she did not have words for. "Just soap," Corporal Davies said quietly. Her face had changed, the granite cracking to reveal something human underneath. "I swear to God it's just soap." The crying continued but changed in character, evolving from terror to something else, something more complicated. Greta sank to her knees in the pooling water and laughed, a broken sound that held no joy. She laughed and cried at the same time, her body shaking with the release of fear so profound it had nowhere else to go. Around her, the other women began to wash. Slowly at first, mechanically, but then with growing conviction, with the recognition that this was truly just a shower, that the Americans had meant what they said about protocols and rights and Geneva Conventions. The soap lathered white against their skin. The water, warming now as the system adjusted, rinsed away weeks of travel grime, months of fear, years of propaganda. Captain Morrison had left the room. He stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, his head in his hands. He was 32 years old. He had fought across North Africa and into Italy. He had seen death in forms that haunted his dreams and would continue to haunt them for decades to come. But he had never seen anything like what just happened, the moment when enemy prisoners revealed themselves as simply terrified women who believed they were about to die. Later, he would write in his report, "Incident during processing of female POWs. Cultural misunderstanding caused extreme distress. Recommend revised procedures for female prisoners, including explanation of protocols in native language before implementation. Guards unprepared for level of fear exhibited. Future female POW arrivals should be processed by female staff, exclusively with male officers excluded." But in that moment in the hallway outside the shower room, where the screaming had finally stopped, replaced by the sound of running water and quiet weeping, he simply stood there and tried not to think about what his government had created, what his enemy had created, what the war had done to everyone it touched. The women were given clean clothes. Military surplus dyed to distinguish them from regular uniforms. They were assigned to Barracks 7, a long wooden building with pot-bellied stoves at each end, and rows of bunks with actual mattresses, actual blankets. The February wind howled outside, but the barracks held heat, held safety. Greta lay in her bunk that first night and stared at the ceiling. She could still feel the cold water on her skin, could still hear the screaming, including her own. But she could also feel the weight of clean clothes, the softness of the blanket pulled up to her chin, the solid reality of a floor that did not move like a ship or a train. Maria, in the bunk beside her, spoke into the darkness. "They think we're insane." "Probably," Greta replied. "We thought they would kill us. Yes, we were wrong." Greta did not answer immediately. Outside, a guard walked past the window, his boots crunching on frozen ground. The shadow passed and disappeared, leaving only moonlight on glass. "Yes," she said finally, "we were wrong." Fort Supply held approximately 400 prisoners by the spring of 1945, mostly German men captured in North Africa or Italy, with the small contingent of women kept separate in their own barrack section. The camp sprawled across Oklahoma prairie land that reminded some prisoners of home, the endless flat horizons, and big skies not unlike parts of Germany, though the red dirt and the quality of light were distinctly American. The women worked. Geneva Convention protocols required it, and idleness bred madness. They were assigned to the camp kitchen, to the laundry facility, to the administrative offices where some who spoke English helped with paperwork and translation. The work was neither difficult nor particularly meaningful, but it provided structure, purpose, a reason to rise when the morning bell rang and to be tired when evening came. Greta peeled potatoes in the kitchen, mountains of them, her hands pruning in cold water, while American cooks prepared meals for prisoners who ate better than many of them had eaten in years. The irony was not lost on her. The enemy fed them 3 times a day, provided medical care, distributed Red Cross packages with chocolate and cigarettes. Meanwhile, letters from home, when they came at all, spoke of hunger, of cities reduced to rubble, of a homeland that seemed to be crumbling faster every week. The propaganda had not prepared them for this contradiction. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be punished, broken, used as examples. Instead, they were being treated better than their own government had treated them for the last 2 years of the war. The American staff at Fort Supply varied in their attitudes toward the prisoners. Some viewed them with open hostility, seeing only the enemy, the embodiment of a war that had killed their brothers, friends, sons. Others treated them with professional detachment, following regulations without emotion or engagement. And a small number, treated them with something approaching sympathy. Lieutenant Grace Wheeler fell into this last category, though she would have denied it if asked directly. She was 28, a nurse from Ohio who had volunteered after Pearl Harbor expecting to serve in field hospitals overseas, but had instead been assigned to POW camp medical duty stateside. She found the assignment frustrating, anticlimactic, until she met the women of Barracks 7. Her first encounter with Greta came 3 weeks after the shower incident. Greta had cut her hand on a broken potato peeler, a deep gash across the palm that bled more than it should. She was sent to the infirmary, a small building near the administrative offices that smelled of iodine and floor wax. Lieutenant Wheeler examined the wound with efficient, practiced hands. She cleaned it, applied antiseptic that stung enough to make Greta wince, then began stitching with thread so fine Greta could barely see it. "You were a mother," Lieutenant Wheeler said in German that was surprisingly good, her accent minimal. It was not a question. Greta looked up sharply. "How did you know?" "Stretch marks, and the way you hold yourself. My mother was a nurse. She taught me to read bodies the way others read books." Lieutenant Wheeler tied off a stitch, her fingers steady. "How old?" "7 now, if she's still alive." Greta's voice caught. "I don't know. The letters stopped coming 6 months ago." Lieutenant Wheeler said nothing for a moment. She finished the stitches, bandaged the hand with white gauze wrapped carefully, precisely. When she looked up, her eyes held something Greta had not seen from an American before: genuine understanding. "My brother was killed at Normandy," Lieutenant Wheeler said quietly. "I'm supposed to hate you, all of you, but I can't seem to manage it." She secured the bandage with medical tape. "Keep this clean, change the dressing daily. Come back in a week so I can check the stitches." "Thank you," Greta whispered. "Don't." Lieutenant Wheeler's face hardened slightly. "Don't thank me for doing my job. Don't make this more complicated than it has to be." But it was already complicated. Everything about Fort Supply was complicated in ways that defied easy categorization or simple emotions. The camp existed in a strange liminal space where enemies became human, where propaganda dissolved in the face of daily interactions, where hatred struggled to survive against the mundane reality of shared space and shared routines. The women learned English. Some picked it up quickly, absorbing the language through constant exposure to American guards, kitchen staff, administrative personnel who spoke to them with varying degrees of patience or impatience. Others struggled, frustrated by unfamiliar sounds and incomprehensible grammar rules that seemed designed to confuse. Maria became nearly fluent within 3 months. She had always been good with languages, had studied French before the war, and English came easier than she expected. She volunteered for extra duty in the administration office, where she helped translate documents, sort mail, maintain records. The work gave her access to information, to glimpses of the world beyond the wire that the other women did not have. She was the first to learn that Germany had surrendered, May 8, 1945. The radio in the administration office crackled with the news, the announcer's voice solemn and triumphant at once. President Truman speaking, Churchill speaking, headlines from every Allied nation declaring victory in Europe. The war was over. Maria sat at her desk, a stack of unfiled papers in front of her, and felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, not even sadness. Just a vast emptiness that stretched as wide as the Oklahoma prairie outside the window. She did not tell the others immediately. She sat through dinner in the mess hall, eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes while around her, the women spoke about letters they hoped would come, about families they might see again, about a future that suddenly seemed possible. She listened to their hope and could not bring herself to destroy it just yet. That night, in the barracks, she finally spoke. The women gathered on bunks, sitting close together as they did during conversations about home, about before, about everything they had lost. Germany surrendered today, Maria said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. The war is over. We lost. The silence that followed was profound. Someone began to cry softly. Someone else laughed, that same broken sound Greta had made in the shower room months ago. Most simply sat still, processing information that should have felt momentous but instead felt inevitable. Like the final note in a symphony they had known was ending for a long time. "What happens to us now?" asked Elsa Braun, a 22-year-old from Munich who had been captured while serving as a radio operator in France. Nobody answered. They had no answer. The war was over, but they remained prisoners, held in Oklahoma while their country existed in some unknown state thousands of miles away, probably occupied, probably destroyed, probably unrecognizable. Greta thought of her daughter. She would be 7 now, possibly 8 if her birthday had passed. She would have grown up in ruins, in hunger, in the shadow of defeat. She might not remember her mother. She might believe her mother was dead. She might be dead herself, buried under rubble or starved or killed in the final desperate months of fighting. "We wait," Greta said finally. "We wait and see if there's anything left to go home to." The camp administration told them officially the next morning. All prisoners were to remain in custody indefinitely until repatriation procedures could be established, until Germany was stable enough to receive its own citizens back, until Allied command decided what to do with hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners scattered across America. The waiting began. Days became weeks, became months. Summer arrived, transforming the Oklahoma landscape from brown to green. The prairie blooming with wild flowers that carpeted the land in colors that seemed impossible after years of gray and rubble and ash. The heat was oppressive, dry and relentless, different from European heat, meaner somehow. The women adapted. They had become good at adapting, at surviving in circumstances that seemed designed to break them. They worked their shifts. They learned more English. They formed relationships that transcended simple prisoner solidarity, developing into genuine friendships born from shared trauma and shared experience. Lieutenant Wheeler became a regular presence in their lives. She conducted weekly medical checks, treated minor injuries and illnesses, distributed aspirin for headaches and salve for sunburns. She also brought news from the outside world, carefully selected pieces of information about the reconstruction of Germany, about the occupation zones, about the Marshall Plan that promised to rebuild what the war had destroyed. "They're saying it will take years," she told Maria during one of these visits. "The cities need to be rebuilt completely. The government has to be restructured. They're running denazification programs, tribunals." "And the people?" Maria asked. "What about the people who had nothing to do with any of it? The mothers, the children, the ones who just tried to survive?" Lieutenant Wheeler had no answer for that. The occupation authorities were still figuring it out, still deciding how to punish a nation while helping it recover, how to hold people accountable, while acknowledging that most had simply been swept along by forces beyond their control. In July, Red Cross representatives visited Fort Supply. They interviewed prisoners, documented conditions, verified that Geneva Convention protocols were being followed. For the women of Barrack 7, the visits felt like performance, like theater where everyone played their assigned roles. Yes, they were treated fairly. Yes, they received adequate food and medical care. Yes, they had no complaints about their treatment. What else could they say? That they were broken, that they were traumatized, that the shame of surrender and the guilt of survival competed with relief at being alive, at being safe, at being far from the rubble and death that defined their homeland. The Red Cross representative who interviewed Greta was a middle-aged woman from Boston with kind eyes and a notebook she filled with precise shorthand. "Do you have any requests?" she asked. "Anything we can help facilitate?" "I want to know if my daughter is alive," Greta said. "Her name is Anna Hoffman. She was in Hamburg with my mother. I haven't heard from them since November." The representative wrote this down. She wrote down all the names, all the addresses, all the desperate questions from women who needed to know what remained of the lives they had left behind. She promised to try, to use Red Cross channels to search for information, to reconnect families when possible. Greta knew better than to hope. She had learned that hope was dangerous, that it could hurt worse than despair. But she hoped anyway, quietly, privately, in the moments before sleep, when the barracks were dark and still, and the Oklahoma night pressed against the windows like something alive. August brought the news about Japan, about atomic bombs that defied comprehension, about a weapon so terrible it ended a war with 2 explosions. The prisoners at Fort Supply heard about it on the radio, the same way they heard about everything, filtered through American voices and American perspectives that made it difficult to understand what had really happened. But they understood enough. They understood that the world had changed, that war had evolved into something beyond battlefield tactics and military strategy. They understood that they had survived something that would mark history forever, that they were witnesses to the end of an era and the beginning of another. "We're relics," Maria said one evening, sitting on the barrack steps and watching the sunset paint the western sky orange and pink. "We belong to a war that's already being turned into history. We're footnotes." Greta sat beside her, smoking one of the cigarettes from the Red Cross packages. She had never smoked before the war, had considered it unladylike, but now she found comfort in the ritual, in the burn of tobacco and the way the smoke dissipated into Oklahoma air. "Better a footnote than a casualty," she replied. "Is it?" Maria looked at her. "Is it really better?" Greta had no answer for that either. The question was too big, too complicated. She was alive. Her daughter might be alive. She had survived when so many had not. But she was also a prisoner, separated from everything she had known, waiting for permission to return to a country that might not want her, that might see her as a reminder of shame and defeat. The repatriation orders came in October. Small groups at first, test cases to see if the system could handle the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners to a devastated nation. The women of Barrack 7 were scheduled for December, placed on a manifest that would see them processed through New York and shipped across the Atlantic to Bremen, then distributed by train to whatever remained of their hometowns. Lieutenant Wheeler told them herself, visiting the barracks one cool evening when the Oklahoma wind carried the smell of approaching winter. She stood in the common area while the women gathered around, and she read the orders with a voice that remained carefully neutral. "You'll leave December 15th, train to New York, then ship to Bremen. Expect the journey to take 2 to 3 weeks." She folded the paper. "Congratulations, you're going home." Nobody congratulated themselves. Nobody cheered. The women simply nodded, accepted the information, began the mental process of preparing for a return that felt more like exile in reverse. That night, Corporal Davies, the MP who had been present during the shower incident, appeared at the barracks door. She had changed over the months, had softened in ways that made her look younger despite the gray that had appeared in her hair. She knocked before entering, an unusual courtesy that made the women look up from their evening routines. "Can I come in?" she asked in her terrible German. Greta nodded. The other women watched silently as the corporal entered, her hands in her pockets, her posture casual but her eyes serious. "I wanted to apologize," Corporal Davies said in English, then paused while Maria translated. "For that first day for the shower, I didn't understand. I should have understood, but I didn't." The women stared at her. Greta felt something tighten in her chest, something that might have been anger or might have been forgiveness or might have been simple exhaustion with emotions that served no purpose anymore. "You were following orders," Greta said in careful English. "We understand orders. That's not an excuse." Corporal Davies pulled her hands from her pockets, spread them in a gesture of helplessness. "I scared you. I hurt you, not physically, but I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Maria translated even though most of the women understood by then. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things, with the weight of trauma acknowledged but not resolved, with recognition that some wounds did not heal simply because someone said sorry. "Thank you," Greta said finally, "for saying it." Corporal Davies nodded. She stood awkwardly for a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "I hope you find what you're looking for when you go back," she said. "I hope your families are whole. I hope it's not as bad as they're saying." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that echoed in the barracks like punctuation. The weeks before departure passed in a strange fugue state. The women packed their few belongings, sorted through Red Cross packages to decide what to take and what to leave, wrote letters to families they hoped were still alive to receive them. The routines of camp life continued, but with a new awareness that these were the last times, the final iterations of rituals that had defined their lives for months. Lieutenant Wheeler gave them all medical examinations, checking that they were healthy enough for travel, for the journey that would take them across an ocean and into an unknown future. She was professional, efficient, but her hands lingered sometimes, adjusting a bandage unnecessarily, checking a heartbeat twice. When she examined Greta, she pulled out an envelope from her medical bag. Plain white paper, thin as tissue, with an address written in pencil that had smudged slightly. "This came through Red Cross channels," Lieutenant Wheeler said softly. "I wasn't supposed to give it to you until after official processing, but—" She pressed the envelope into Greta's hand. "You deserve to know before you go." Greta looked at the envelope. Her hands trembled. The return address was Hamburg, but the handwriting was not her mother's, not Anna's childish scrawl. Someone else had written this. She opened it there in the infirmary, while Lieutenant Wheeler pretended to organize supplies. The letter was short, written in German by someone who signed themselves as a neighbor, someone who had known her mother before the firebombing that destroyed half of Hamburg in July of 1943. Her mother was dead. Anna was alive. She was living with the neighbors who had written the letter, who had promised to care for her until Greta could return. She was 8 years old now. She was thin but healthy. She was in school. She remembered her mother but understood her mother might never come back. Greta folded the letter carefully, precisely, and placed it in her pocket. She looked up at Lieutenant Wheeler with eyes that held too much to be expressed in words. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry about your mother," Lieutenant Wheeler replied, "but your daughter is alive. That's something. In this world, right now, that's everything." Greta nodded. She could not speak anymore. Good. She left the infirmary and walked across the camp to the barracks, where she lay on her bunk and cried silently into her pillow, until Maria found her and held her without asking questions. December 15th arrived too fast and too slow at once. The women of Barrack 7 stood on the same platform where they had arrived nearly a year ago, but everything had changed. The winter was milder than their first had been. They wore better clothes, American-made coats and hats donated by organizations that help displaced persons. They carried proper luggage instead of ragged bags. They were also different. Thinner in some ways, fuller in others. The war had changed them, but so had the peace, so had the months in Oklahoma, so had the slow dissolution of propaganda in the face of daily reality that refused to conform to what they had been told to expect. Captain Morrison supervised the loading. He looked older now, more worn. though only 10 months had passed since he had stood in that hallway outside the shower room and questioned everything he thought he understood about duty and humanity. He approached Greta as she waited to board. "Mrs. Hoffman," he said in English, knowing she understood now. "Captain," she replied. "I hope." He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. "I hope you find your daughter well. I hope Germany rebuilds quickly. I hope you can forget all of this." Greta smiled sadly. "I don't want to forget, Captain. Forgetting is how it happened in the first place." He nodded. He had no response to that. He stepped back, saluted her awkwardly, formally, as if she were not a prisoner but a soldier being honorably discharged. The train carried them east through winter landscape that blurred past the windows. Frozen fields, small towns, cities that had not been touched by war, their buildings whole, their streets busy with Christmas shoppers and normal life. The women watched America pass and tried to prepare themselves for what they would find when they returned to a Germany that existed now only in memory and rumor. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was crowded with repatriated prisoners, mostly men, all of them marked by the same uncertainty, the same fear mixed with hope, mixed with resignation. The journey took 2 weeks through rough winter seas that left most of them sick and miserable. When they finally saw Bremen through morning fog, saw the destroyed docks and gutted buildings and rubble that stretched as far as eyes could see, the reality of defeat settled over them like a physical weight. This was home. This was what remained. This was what they had survived for. Greta stood on the deck, gripping the rail with hands that had peeled potatoes in an Oklahoma kitchen, that had been bandaged by an American nurse who had lost her brother but could not manage hatred. She thought about the shower room, about the terror that had turned out to be just water, about the moment when she realized that not all enemies were evil, and not all allies were good, and that the world was more complicated than propaganda allowed. She thought about Anna waiting in Hamburg. She thought about the long train journey that still lay ahead, about the uncertain reunion with a daughter who had grown up without her, about rebuilding a life from rubble and memory. The ship docked, the gangway lowered. The prisoners filed off into a Germany they barely recognized, into a future that belonged to survivors, and witnesses and women who had learned to live with contradictions. Greta walked down the gangway with her American-donated luggage, and the letter in her pocket, and the memory of Oklahoma's sunset burning behind her eyes. She walked into ruins that would someday be rebuilt, into a nation that would someday recover, into a life that would always carry the mark of that February day when cold water felt like death and turned out to be just a shower after all. Behind her, the Atlantic stretched gray and cold toward an America that would fade from memory, but never completely disappear, toward an Oklahoma camp that would be decommissioned within a year, torn down and returned to prairie, leaving only official records and fading photographs, and the memories carried by women who had learned that the enemy could be kind, and that kindness was its own kind of victory, quieter than war, but more transformative in the end. The barracks at Fort Supply stood empty through the winter of 1946. Spring came, and wildflowers bloomed between the buildings. Summer heat warped the wood and peeled the paint. By autumn, demolition crews arrived and tore it all down, returning the land to what it had been before, as if the camp had never existed, as if the war had never reached this far inland, as if Oklahoma prairie had never held the tears of German women who thought they were going to die and found instead that they were going to live, whether they wanted to or not. History records the facts. Fort Supply prisoner of war camp held 437 enemy prisoners at peak capacity. No escapes were recorded. 1 death from pneumonia. Medical care rated above standard. Decommissioned March 1946. Land returned to agricultural use. The records say nothing about the shower room, nothing about the screaming, nothing about the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered against the truth of human complexity. Some things cannot be recorded, in official documents can only be carried by those who experience them, passed down in stories that fade with each generation until they become myth legend, half-remembered anecdotes about a war that remade the world. Greta found Anna in Hamburg. living in half a house that had somehow survived the firebombing. Her daughter was 8 years old, thin and serious and speaking German with an accent Greta did not recognize, shaped by years of displacement and uncertainty. They looked at each other across a gulf of time and trauma, mother and daughter who were strangers now, who would have to learn each other again from the beginning. "I'm home," Greta said, knowing it was not quite true, that home was something they would have to rebuild together, that it might never feel the way it had before. "Yes," Anna replied, equally uncertain, equally aware that nothing would ever be simple again. They stood in the ruins of Hamburg and began the slow process of becoming a family again, of learning to live in a world that had almost destroyed them but had, in the end, simply changed them beyond recognition. The war was over. The surviving had just begun. Years later, when Greta was old and Anna was a mother herself, they would talk about the war in the careful way survivors do, touching on memories like wounds that never quite healed. Greta told her daughter about Oklahoma, about the camp, about the shower room where she had screamed thinking she was going to die. They were just following orders, Greta said. They didn't understand. "Did you hate them?" Anna asked. Greta thought about Lieutenant Wheeler. She thought about Corporal Davies and her apology. She thought about Captain Morrison saluting her on the platform. She thought about the complexity of memory and the impossibility of simple answers. "No," she said finally. "I never hated them. That might have been easier. Hate is simple. What I felt was more complicated than that." Anna nodded, understanding in the way that children of survivors understand, carrying the weight of history they did not live through but inherited anyway. Outside, modern Hamburg stretched into evening, rebuilt and prosperous and nothing like the ruins Greta had returned to in 1945. The world had moved on. The war had become history, then legend, then eventually just another chapter in textbooks that reduced complexity to timelines and casualty figures. But in that moment, in the comfortable apartment where Greta lived out her remaining years, the past was present, alive in the way it always is for those who carry it. The shower room existed still in her memory, complete with every detail. The cold water, the screaming, the moment of terrible recognition that she would live when she had expected to die. "Tell me about Oklahoma," Anna said, as she had asked many times before, wanting to understand, wanting to know her mother's story in full. So Greta told her. She told her about the endless prairie and the big sky and the heat that shimmered like glass. She told her about peeling potatoes and learning English and watching American soldiers who were not monsters, but simply men doing a job they had been assigned. She told her about the contradictions and the complexity, and the way propaganda dissolved in the face of daily kindness. She told her about the shower, and the crying and the cold water that was just water after all. And in the telling, in the remembering, in the passing down of story from survivor to child, the history became something more than facts, something more than official records. It became testimony. It became witness. It became a small truth preserved against the simplifications of time. The women of Barrack 7 scattered across Germany after repatriation. Most survived. Some did not, broken by what they had lost, unable to rebuild in ruins. They rarely spoke about Fort Supply in later years, about the months they spent as prisoners in Oklahoma, about the shame and relief that came with being captured rather than killed. But sometimes in quiet moments they would remember. They would think about the camp and the work, and the slow transformation of fear into something approaching understanding. They would think about the Americans who had been their captors and sometimes their protectors, who had fed them and housed them and eventually sent them home. And they would think about the shower room, about the day they learned that sometimes the worst thing you can imagine is just what it appears to be, that sometimes water is just water, that sometimes the enemy is just another person caught in the machinery of war, trying to do right and getting it wrong and apologizing when it's already too late to matter and still early enough to make a difference. The story ends. The women lived. The war ended. Time passed. Memory faded but never completely disappeared, carried forward by those who experienced it, and those who inherited it, by survivors and children and grandchildren who ask questions about a past that shaped their present. Fort Supply is gone. The barracks are gone. The shower room is gone. Oklahoma Prairie reclaimed the land, as indifferent to history as it had been to everything else, simply existing, simply continuing, the grass growing and dying and growing again in cycles that transcend human conflict. But the women remember. Even now, even after death has claimed most of them. The memory persists in letters and diaries and oral histories carefully preserved by those who understand that some stories must be told, that some truths cannot be allowed to fade. This is one of those stories. This is the truth they carried. This is what happened when German women prisoners of war were forced to shower in Oklahoma and broke down crying because they thought they were going to die and learned instead that they were going to live, that the enemy could be complicated, that propaganda lies, that kindness exists even in war, that sometimes the worst moment of your life is also the moment when you begin to understand that nothing is as simple as you were taught to believe. The shower was just a shower. The water was just water. But the transformation was real, permanent, carried forward through decades and across oceans, and into a future those women could never have imagined when they stood terrified and naked under fluorescent lights in an Oklahoma POW camp and screamed because they expected death and received only the cold, brutal, cleansing truth of survival.